we're going to look at the first theory of memory, which is called the Multistore model of memory. And this is the theory that really talks about the nature side, or what's physically going on in the brain. So to boil this down and make it really simple, it's called the Multistore model because there are 3 stores in your memory. The first is quite simple. It is sensory, because the information that comes in through your senses is the only information that can possibly make it into your memory. So before things get into your brain, they've got to come in through your senses. Your senses encode them, turns them into a signal which travels to your brain, and then you're able to kind of process that. Now, there's lots of information coming into your senses all the time, and if you were to be aware of all of it, you'd be completely overwhelmed. In fact, if you know anyone with sensory processing issues, that's kind of what it is. They can't filter out irrelevant sensory information, but most people can. This is why you have the ability to sit in a classroom and have no idea what the teacher's been saying, because your brain filters out irrelevant information. If, however, you pay attention, then the sensory information will enter your short-term store. And that is where you become really aware of information that's coming in, and you can now do something about it. So you can think about it, you can try to remember it, you can kind of work with it. Sometimes this is referred to as a working memory, but it's really what demands your conscious attention. So, information that is in your short-term store, you're able to kind of work on. This is what you are thinking about. However, short-term store is called short-term because, exactly like it sounds, it doesn't last very long. In order to permanently recall and be able to remember things, it needs to enter the final store, which is your long-term store. Now, to get something to move from your short-term store into your long-term store, according to this model and theory, the only way to do that is actually to rehearse the information, or to repeat it, or to revise it, or to review it. So this is why a lot of education is focused on coming back to information, revisiting and rehearsing it. Your long-term memories are basically a pattern that is made with the neurons in your brain. It's a pathway that gets lit up. And in order for a pathway to become stronger in your brain, you have to activate it several times. That's why you become better at the things that you practice. So to get from short-term to long-term memory, the more you repeat or rehearse information, the more that pathway in your brain will be strengthened, and you'll be able to remember it much easier when you need it, for example, in the exam. So, in an ideal world, this is what happens. This is how memory works. Stuff comes into your senses, you pay attention to it, you do something with it, you kind of figure out, okay, what does this mean? And then it goes into your long-term store. But we all know from our own experience that that doesn't happen all the time. And this is where forgetting kind of enters the picture. So I'm going to add forgetting on the bottom. Now, you can forget information from any of these 3 stores. The most common way that things forget is that they just naturally fade with time. The word that we use to describe that is decay. From your sensory store, as soon as something comes in from your senses, it fades almost instantly. For example, if you were listening to a song and you turn it off, you can't still physically hear that song after you've turned it off. It decays pretty much straight away. So, in the exam, this will be referred to as the duration, okay? So in the sensory store, decay happens after a duration of a couple of seconds, okay? Within the short-term store, we also experience, if I can spell today, this decay, but it lasts a little bit longer. Once you've paid attention to something and it's kind of floating around in your brain, the research points to about 30 seconds being the average length of time that information stays until it decays. And it decays if you don't rehearse it. In the long-term store, it is possible for things that you at one point kind of had memorized to fade. However, the research is a lot less specific and clear about that, often with the right kind of prompt, you can recall something that you had forgotten. You know, something can remind you of it. So there's no clear length of time. For all intents and purposes, your long-term store has an infinite duration. So memory decays, the duration is a few seconds, 30 seconds, potentially infinite, although we know it still can happen with your long-term store. So the next thing that you need to know about these stores is how much information they hold and what kind of information they hold. Your sensory store has a very large capacity. If you think about the amount of information that's coming in through your eyes at any one time, then add all the information of what you can hear, of what you can feel. If you need to, you can check how your skin feels, you know, like I could think about it and be like, yeah, my shoes are a little bit tight, or something like that. So there's a massive amount of information. Most of it you completely ignore. However, it is a very large capacity. Your sensory store can take in a huge amount. This is not very scientific, large, but that's kind of what the exam's expecting you to know. Your short-term memory is much more restricted. Basically, your short-term store has been shown to be able to hold 7 plus or minus 2, so that's the average range, kind of between 5 and 9, chunks of information. Now, chunks sounds like a really weird word to use when we're talking about memory, but essentially what it means is you can hold this many items. So if you were memorizing numbers, you would probably be able to remember roughly 7 numbers. If you're remembering words, it'd be roughly 7 words. Point is, it's a chunk of information. 7 plus or minus 2 is called Miller's number, and that's what we tend to find no matter what country or culture. It's about what your short-term memory can handle. Long-term store, again, is a little different. Just like with the duration, it's much more difficult to measure. We've never really found the limits. And so the capacity of your long-term store, in theory, is infinite. There are people who have memorized incredible amounts of information and they've never reached the point where their brain just flashes up full and nothing new can go in. So, last couple of bits that you need to know about this. Decay is the only way memory fades from our short-term memory, from our sensory memory. In our short-term memory, it's a little different. Not only can stuff naturally decay over time, but because you have such a limited capacity in your short-term memory, you can experience another type of forgetting. You can experience displacement. So any of you who are good with science will probably be aware that displacement refers to something pushing something else out. It's a little bit like replacement. So in your short-term memory, because you can only hold a small amount of information, if you try to absorb and pay attention to new information coming in, it will eventually displace what was in there before. So within short-term store, you have 2 types of forgetting. You also have 2 types of forgetting that occur in the long-term store. Have any of you had the experience of maybe going into another room to try and get something, and then you get to the other room and you've no idea why you've gone there? Happens to me quite often, hopefully not just because I'm old. I'm hoping this is a common experience. Retrieval failure occurs because there is so much in your long-term store that it can be difficult for your brain to remember the correct bit of information. So there are things that we all know, but sometimes just can't remember in that moment. So there might be a word for something or somebody's name, and you're like, oh, I know it, but I just can't, it'll come to me later. That is retrieval failure. Your brain is searching through so many different pathways, so many different memories, that it just can't quite select the right one in that moment. And it probably will at some other point, or if you get a cue to remind you. So for me, I'm upstairs, I go downstairs to get something, I get downstairs and I cannot remember what I went down for. Then I go back upstairs, and as soon as I get back upstairs, I remember what I needed, because going back up is the cue that triggers that memory for me. So those are all your types of forgetting: decay, displacement and decay, retrieval failure and decay. Final bit of information that you need for multi-store model is you need to know what type of memory or how the information is what's called encoded. So in the exam, it's possible you'll get this weird word called encoding, and what it wants you to know is that the type of memory in your sensory store is sensory information. So it is encoded as sensory information. So visual information goes to the visual part of your brain. Short-term memory is a little different. Short-term memory tends to be auditory. Or, in other words, if you're trying to remember something and work with it in your brain, you're probably using words for that. So if I gave you a string of numbers to remember, you'd probably repeat them to yourself. So your short-term memory uses language to help. With your long-term store, it is mainly information and facts and knowledge that is stored there, and we call that semantic. And so, kind of a pain. I don't have any amazingly good ways to help you remember this, just that sensory store is obvious. This, you're going to say it to yourself to try and remember it, and once it's in your long-term store, the information is in there. So that is the multi-store model. So, multi-store model. Final thing is obviously you need to know how to criticize the multi-store model or give a weakness or evaluate. Those are the three words that you might be given in an exam. All really mean the same thing. So, main problems with the multi-store model. First off, because it's a nature-based theory, it's looking at the physical process of memory, it ignores nurture. And you need to back that up. So a good kind of point to bear in mind when we're saying it ignores nurture is, do you have any memories that you haven't really ever rehearsed? Something that's happened to you and you've just instantly remembered it and you can't seem to forget it even if you want to. Well, that really isn't explained by this. You should have to rehearse all things equally to remember them, but we all know that you don't. So particularly memories or experiences that are really emotional, for example, are likely to be stored in your long-term memory without any extra effort on your part. So nurture helps us kind of recognize that meaning and emotion can affect memory, but it doesn't feature on that kind of science-y nature side of the theory. Because it ignores nurture and the effect of, say, emotions and stuff like that, we can say that this theory is reductionist. And that really is a very key point. This is a very reductionist theory. Memory is very complicated. It affects all of us in loads of different ways all the time, and just boiling it down to a little flowchart and a few facts, definitely reductionist. So the main problems, it ignores nurture, making it reductionist, doesn't factor in details like why do some people remember random facts or random experiences that they've never rehearsed. The other final criticism, again, you only ever really need two, but just to make sure that you are well equipped with criticisms, is that a lot of scientists actually recognize that the long-term store isn't really a single store, because there are different types of memory. So for example, your muscle memory or your procedural memory, which is your ability to do physical coordinating sort of skills, like how to ride a bike, that is stored in a completely different part of your brain to your memory of the times tables. Procedural memory is in your cerebellum, whereas knowing facts is in your frontal lobe. So it treats the long-term store like it's a single thing, when actually even other nature-based theories recognize that it's not that simple and different memories are stored in different parts of your brain. So that is it for the multi-store model, describing it and evaluating.